Yay, good. Well, welcome, fellow Lions, to this very important presentation. Pleased to see a number of you have turned up this morning. Can I again remind everyone who's there to mute yourselves? If not, I shall start muting all of you in a minute. So this morning's session is about health and safety, a very important subject which has been relatively ignored, in my opinion, because people, it's a usual saying, it doesn't apply to me. It does. With the change with the legislation that has come about in the last few years, and the attitude and the litigation culture which is coming into this country, it's not yet America, but it is there. We all got to be very careful, and above all, we need to make sure that we are covered. Our insurances will cover us, and all this will only happen if we comply with the regulations and at least have some understanding of what our responsibilities are. So this morning's session, which is going to be run by District Officer Mukesh Palan and his co-coordinator Craig, who are there to help you in this district, guide you and help you. They will jointly present this session. We will take questions after about 40 minutes. You'll have enough time for question and answer. But if you feel a question come up, do use the chat line if you like for questions. No more good mornings in there, please, if you don't mind. And then we can have a decent conversation after the presentation. So without much ado, I am now going to call upon Mukesh, who is going to do the talking to begin with. And Craig has his fingers on the buzzer, well, not the buzzer, the click button to change the slides for him. So Mukesh, over to you.
Good morning to you all. Thank you for coming to this webinar or Zoom. I want to thank Viresh for organizing this. And as Viresh said, that this will be co-presented by my colleague, Lion Craig, who will do his presentation or part of the presentation halfway through. We have a lot of information on our district website, which we will guide you where it is at the end of this presentation. So without taking too much time, I will take you through some of the slides first. So welcome all. Today we'll cover the essential information to ensure that your safety and well-being while carrying out your club activities are adhered to. Risk assessments are a must. They make a real difference to the health and safety, and our Lions organization must do them. If we don't do risk assessments, then we may not be covered. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, I haven't done risk assessment, which I think is incorrect because we all do them anyway, when crossing the road, driving the car, walking, etc. It's just that we don't put it down. So this presentation provides a step-by-step guidance explaining how to create effective risk assessments for your club. Right, next slide, please. So as I said before, there are legal, financial, and moral reasons to do risk assessments. Everyone has a right to be protected. We have a duty of care from harm, especially if it could have been avoided. Identifying and dealing with risks that could harm is the right thing to do. We must do them. Our members are our greatest asset. If the risk can be prevented and wasn't, this is unacceptable. There will be fines for compensation. We are as Viresh said, that we are in a litigious world, and we want to make sure that we cover all aspects. Injuries to anybody affected by one or any of our activities can lead to compensation claims. If we don't have a risk assessment, next slide, please. If you don't have a risk assessment, then we will be, guilty. By the way, if you infringe health and safety, it's a criminal offense. So what is a hazard? A hazard is anything that could cause harm. And as mentioned, we've all done risk assessments. We don't put it down on paper. It is not rocket science. It's just common sense. So think about crossing a road. Example, cars are a hazard. We don't do a risk assessment, but we are aware of it. We know what to look out for, looking left, right, etc., indicating speeds, weather conditions, etc. So we do that anyway. So the next slide, please. So there are physical hazards, the chemical hazards, biomedical hazards, mechanical and ergonomics hazards, environmental hazards, organizational hazards. So these are some of the hazards which you come across in all your functions. Hazards which, essentially all hazards must be identified, recorded on a risk assessment with appropriate control measures put down. Next slide, please. So do we need to do a risk assessment for everything? I don't think you need to do it for everything. You don't need to do a risk assessment for everything. You do need to consider everything, but you only need to do a risk assessment for hazards which are reasonably foreseeable and which may cause harm. Our insurance company may require a risk assessment, so it is essential you do them. The risk assessment should be suitable and sufficient. Insignificant risks, normal risks, can usually be ignored and as can risks arising from routine activities. We don't put down every little bit. It's unusual risks, something which we don't come across on a day-to-day basis. Your risks should only include what you could reasonably be expected to know. We don't forecast things, but we look at the activity we're carrying out and we look at the potential risks, and Craig will go through the degrees of risks which we may come across. You're not anticipated to anticipate any unforeseeable risks. You have to be reasonable about this. Next slide, please. It is important to be aware that you don't need to do a formal risk assessment for everything. You do need to consider everything, but you only need to do risk assessment for hazards which are reasonably foreseeable and which may cause harm. So if a reasonable person could recognize the risks associated with any work or the activities, that should be applied and reasonably put on a form. So I think we need to be reasonable. We need to make sure that anything which is out of the ordinary should be put down, and the degree of the risks which Craig will go through. Next slide, please. So hazard and risk. So you see a typical risk here with the cable going across. So the risk is the chance that a hazard will cause harm and how serious that harm could be. An example, do we need to carry out a risk assessment for a cable across the stairs? The risk depends on many factors. Where the cable might be near an edge, tucked away out of sight. It might be in an area where many people walk by, how big or visible it is. So the level of the risk is not fixed. It depends on many things and some which will affect likelihood and some affect the consequence. A trailing cable across a busy walkway, however, clearly presents a foreseeable risk of harm, so it does require a risk assessment. So what control measures might you think of putting in place for trailing electrical cable? Tape down is one of them. There's special guards available as well we can put across a cable coming through. The hazard remains the same, but the risk changes as your judgment call is based on not just the hazard, but on who it affects, how it affects, and the potential consequences. Next slide, please. So do you need a risk assessment making a cup of coffee or tea? In many cases, the answer would be no. And I'll put a caveat on this. It depends on where you're making this cup of coffee. That's very important. Is it in a public place? Is an urn which is hot, which should be kept away from your participants, etc. So in most cases, the answer would be no. There's an example of a routine activity associated with life in general. You wouldn't usually need to do anything as the risk level is perfectly acceptable. We do this day in, day out. However, move the kettle to a busy environment, which I mentioned, with small children or infirm or disabled people around, the risk increases. it is now a reasonably foreseeable risk. You see what I'm saying? That if you move the urn or a kettle next to children or other people, then the risk increases. So you need to do something about it. If you're not sure, then you should do a risk assessment. That's my mantra. You should do a risk assessment, even if you don't, you feel it's not necessary. It's better to do it than not do it at all. Of course, making a cup of tea for two is totally different from using a gas-powered burp or boiler on a temporary table in a field. You see what I'm saying? The table may collapse, somebody might come in contact with hot surfaces, etc. So you have to assess the risk depending on the situation you are in. Next slide, please. So we're looking at dynamic risk assessments. The risk assessment that we prepare are based on our knowledge of the event or activity that we may need to assess. This can be based on prior knowledge that we have ourselves or from speaking to others. The resultant risk assessment may not cover all the eventualities, things that can happen that can change some aspects of the event. The likelihood of the risk has changed. It was expected to be sunny, but is now howling gale or is snowing. So, you have to be aware that risks change. I did a function once and we had about 800 people coming and the weather forecast was gloomy and it started snowing, but we had provisions in place. We had spades and rock salt, etc., which we cleared the snow and put it there. So you have to make sure that risk assessments are not static. It depends on the circumstances and we change. So totally. So at the start of the event, it is good practice to look at the location, the weather, the members that have turned up. Has anything changed that will impact your event? Has this improved matters or could have been worse, as I mentioned about the snow? So you see, we've just completed a dynamic assessment. Generally, when you do a risk assessment, you go to the site, a place where you're going to hold it well before, have a look at it, see the lay of the land. And then you might do it a few days before, just make sure that things haven't moved. As I mentioned, it's a dynamic. And then you might do it on the day, just before your guests arrive. Make sure that things haven't changed, which Craig will go through. So next slide, please. So where things are unpredictable or constantly changing, where all of the hazards that will be present aren't known until the task is started. That is what I call a dynamic risk assessment. So it's a changing thing. So where new hazards may be introduced during a task. So be aware of this. You just can't prepare a form, put it away and say, that's it. You have to make sure that your risk assessment stands. Incidentally, every time you do a risk assessment, you have to sign it, you have to date it. And if you go back and you revisit your risk assessment, you need to put the revised date as well and the time when you went to make sure that there's a trail of your assessments in place. Next slide, please. So the message is continually observe, assess, and analyze an environment to identify hazards and remove risks while completing a task. This is what I explained to you. Risks may change during the day, so the event leaders will need to deal with any new risks as it arises. This is literally thinking on your feet. Some of you maybe worked in industries where the dynamic risk forms a process that can be recorded in some form, often referred to as take two or toolbox talks. I used to work in the building industry, and the first thing you do every morning is you have a 10-minute talk. So you highlight where the specific risks are, what are the risks on the day, any weather or equipment related. So it's important that you review your risk assessments. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but you just have a quick chat with your team and say, look, I've just noticed this, or we may have another issue here, and you record it and you put it down, date it, you have a trail of your assessment in place. So that's what I'm saying. I think I'll now hand over to my colleague, Craig, who will take over with the 5 steps to risk assessment. Perhaps, Craig, you can introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Craig. I'm from the Luton Club. I've been on the health and safety training along with Mukesh. I'm part of the multiple districts health and safety team. So 5 steps to risk assessment. So in this section, we're going to go through simply the widely used step-by-step risk assessment process. It's an industry standard, and it's what everyone follows. So the steps are that you accurately identify the potential hazards, you look at who might be harmed and how, and consider what you're already doing and decide how likely it is that harm's going to occur. You need to decide what further action is needed to control the risk, and you need to make sure you record all of your significant findings. And you then need to review these findings. If it's a static task that's done on a day-to-day basis, you might want to review this every month, every 3 months, annually. But if it's a one-off thing, like an event that you've organized, you've pre-done your risk assessment, and as Mukesh says, on the day you want to have your toolbox talk, revisit your plan, revisit your risk assessment. Has anything changed on the day? Has the weather changed? Do you need to put in any extra controls? The main important bit is let all your team know, record it down on a bit of paper, keep it with your risk assessment. The main key point with health and safety, to keep you covered, to keep us covered, is a paper trail, have everything on paper. So looking at the first step, identifying the potential hazards in your workplace. We talk about workplace because that's what the law tends to use. Yes, we know you're all volunteers, but when you're at an event, you're doing the charity activity, as far as the law is concerned, under health and safety, that's your workplace. So first thing you need to do is walk around the activity, around the task that you're doing, looking very carefully and objectively at everything. You want to make notes of hazards that you see, perhaps take photos if it's a very significant hazard that you find. And it's important that you don't miss anything. So you need to plan your route around the event carefully, make sure you've covered every area, the public areas, the bits behind the scenes where the volunteers are working that the public might not go. And as you go around the activity, think about the processes that are being done. Are there any chemicals being used? Is there any noise going on? What the ground conditions like? Is it smooth? Is it bumpy? Is it wet? Is it slippery? Is it dry? All those type of things. So hazards are around us all the time. Some are really obvious, others aren't so obvious. So you need to look carefully. And you need to make sure that you consider not only things that could go wrong now, but you also need to consider long-term health and safety hazards. So exposure to noise, poor posture, sitting or lifting, the pressure work. It might not harm you right now in the short term, but it could have a long-term detrimental effect. So repeated regular lifting, if you're not doing it right, it could cause you back problems later on in life. You could have limb issues. If you're constantly subjected to noise, you could suffer hearing loss. Or if you're always stressed, you could end up with anxiety or depression. Now, you can use previous accident reports that you've seen, sicknesses, if you keep a near-miss record, talking to people to help you find and think of these risks. Looking at all that sort of stuff, it's going to tell you what's happened in the past and what you might need to look at going forward for recurring accidents or injuries. You need to take into account non-routine things that happen, such as maintenance or cleaning. Bear in mind that it can be easy to overlook a hazard when you're routinely doing a task. You become complacent over it, so you don't think about what you're doing, but there could still be a hazard there. But the hazard might not be for you, it might be for someone else. And remember, you don't need to do a risk assessment for everything, because Mukesh has already previously said, it's only the things that are reasonably likely to cause harm. So once we've found our risks and hazards, we then need to assess them. Now, the law says that our risk assessments must be suitable and sufficient, which means they must reflect the hazards and the risks that we found. It needs to be a record of what's truly going on, and they must be done by someone with the correct skills and competency. So you need to have a little bit of knowledge of health and safety. You need to know how to look at the risks, which is what we're going through now. So this helps give you a nice little starting base on how to do the risk assessment. Use the knowledge of other experienced Lions. They're a brilliant source of information for the events that are going on. They might have done these in the past, so they know what's happened before. They know what might happen again in the future. Also, on the MD website, we've got a lot of good health and safety guidance, and also on the district's website, which near the end, we're going to give you the links to those websites. You can also go look at the health and safety website. Many good things on there, lots of information. They're also very good at popping up articles of incident and hazards of things that have happened, how things have been controlled, and that sort of stuff. So one way to assess competency when assessing risk is think of the word SCAPE. Think of skills, knowledge, the right attitude, training, and experience. All the volunteers who work in the location or activity should be involved. They know what's going on. They know what could happen. They might notice things that you're not likely to notice because you're not doing those tasks or activities. You can talk to us as your district health and safety team. You can also talk to us as the MD health and safety team. If we don't know something for you right now, we've got access to resource and other people. We can go away and find out the information for you and come back to you. We can also go off and talk to Bridget and get information from the district, from the MD's insurance company. Always remember that you need to take all of the legal requirements that are required for the event and activity that you're doing. You can use manufacturers' instructions and information. You can search the internet for help on potential hazards in relating to specific machinery you're using or chemicals. There might even be some model assessments online. We've also got some examples online of risk assessments that will help you as a good starting point. But whatever you need, there's always help to be found somewhere. If it's not from us, it's from other Lions, it's from health and safety, it's from MD, it's from Bridget. So assessing the risks, just to cap it off, you need to consider how likely someone is going to be harmed and how bad they're going to be harmed. And you need to do this for each hazard that you come across. So it will be a line on your risk assessment, which we'll go through. And then you need to decide what your risk level is going to be. So once we've decided what our risks are, we then need to think about controlling the risks. The law says we have to do everything that's reasonably practicable to protect anyone who comes into the workplace. So it's anyone that comes into the event. It can be your volunteers, it can be your public. And all we have to do is do everything that's reasonable to mitigate the risk. You don't have to do everything because there's factors that affect those, which we'll go over later. And there's inherent risks in everything we do, and we deem that it's an acceptable level, so we carry on. It's not about being perfect. It's about doing everything that you reasonably should be expected to do. If you do decide to do something that needs to be done, you must decide who's responsible for carrying out that action and when they need to do it by. So there's a hierarchy of controls which we use for controlling risk. And it's appeared in an upside down triangle, going from the most effective to the least effective. Now, the most effective thing we can do to prevent harm from a hazard is elimination. Get rid of the hazard entirely, it's no longer a problem. But quite often we can't eliminate the risk or the hazard because it's a job or an activity that needs to be done. So if we're using chemicals, can we substitute the chemical for something that's not as harmful? Can we use a different piece of machinery that's less likely to cause injury? If we can't do that, then we need to engineer controls. And I've lost my notes on those. Okay. Engineering controls. So if we're thinking about machinery, or have we got guards and things on it? Can we put barriers in place to stop people going near the risk or the hazard? Then we can move down to administrative control, so we can make policies and procedures that says only trained people can do particular tasks. And then finally, we move down to PPE. So everyone just thinks, oh, we'll just throw a bit of PPE at it. We'll make everyone wear hard hat, goggles, gloves. PPE is great for certain things, but it doesn't reduce the risk of some hazards, but it is always a good help. But it's not your first line. Your first line is always, can you eliminate? So, for example, we can put barriers around something to isolate the Lions staff or the members from the public. If it's a noisy piece of equipment, like a generator, we can move that away from the public and the staff so they're not constantly subjected to the noise. We need to look, can you manage the way people work to reduce exposure to hazard? For example, by reducing the number of times a hazardous task is repeated, by reducing the maximum weight of a load, or by reducing the time spent in a noisy, hazardous environment. Is job rotation possible? So can we switch jobs through the day so that you're not repeating the same task over and over and over again for a long period of time? We might need to put in more safety signage. We might need to alter some of the PPE. It's dangerous always to assume that wearing PPE alone is going to keep someone safe. It doesn't. A lot of the time people forget it, they don't look after it, they don't wear it correctly, or they just decide they're not going to wear it. As we've said before, it's a good idea to talk with everyone that's involved, who regularly carries out the activity and task, and get their view. They may have some good ideas about how to control the risk, and see what controls may or may not work in practice. And then we need to record our findings. So for each hazard you identify, you need to decide who could be harmed and how they might be harmed. You don't need to list the people by name, simply by the job that's being done or the area that's being worked in. Take account of anyone who may come into your work area, such as Lions, volunteers, members of the public, children. And if you share your work area with another organization, because you might be doing an event, co-doing an event with another charitable organization, and they might be the lead of the event. You'll need to ensure your risk assessments take into account of that. You need to tell each other about any risks that might affect the other organization and corporate, and coordinate with each other to control the health and safety risks overall for the whole event. You must make sure you consider people who may have particular requirements, such as new or expecting mothers. young people, people with disabilities, senior citizens. Consider how many people are going to be affected by that risk or hazard. For example, a slippery entranceway into the building may be hazardous to everyone. Food allergies may only affect certain individuals. Allergen information is a legal requirement, and the risk of allergens present should be signed clearly, and Lions working with food brief to advise the public on this. And the last step is to review the control. So you always need to review controls in an ongoing manner. And as we've said earlier, if it's a one-off event, you've already done your risk assessment, you need to look at it again dynamically on the day, and quite likely dynamically throughout the day. So you always need to check that all your required actions are being completed, and that people are being assigned to their task correctly, and they're following your steps on an ongoing basis and by any due dates that you've set. And on completion, paperwork needs to be filled in and signed to say these things were done. You must review the controls you put in place and make sure that they're working. If they're not working, you need to revisit those and think about changing those. And you must review them if there have been any significant changes, for example, in people, processes, practices and legislations. Have you got new volunteers? Have you got people moving within the organisation? Is there new equipment? Are there new, better ways of working? You also need to review what you're doing if someone has spotted any problems, or if there's been an accident or an incident, or there's been a near miss, because it indicates then that your controls aren't working properly. And of course, it's important that your risk assessments, they always stay up to date. So do you think it's better to control measures which deal with a hazard, or those which rely on human behavior only? If we can, our control measures should always deal with the hazard, if we can, rather than just relying on human behavior, because a lot of the time, 80% of workplace accidents, they're down to the people, they're down to someone not following the rules, trying to take a shortcut. So it's far better to deal with the hazard if we can. So we need to prioritize our hazards as well. So you've identified your hazard. How do you decide what you're going to tackle first? Well, it's fairly obvious you're going to deal with the hazard that's most likely going to cause harm and is going to cause serious harm or injury. But at the moment, you might only be able to put something temporary in place. But then as time goes on and you look at the activity, you can then go on and put something more permanent in place. And there may be times when you can't carry out an activity because it's too risky. So if you're on a field event, you're putting up a gazebo and it's blowing a gale, you might decide, okay, we can't put this up today now because there's going to be serious risk of injury of it blowing down while we're putting it up, or blowing away once we've put it up and going into the crowds. So when you've identified some hazards, which do you deal with first? Do you deal with your most serious hazards? Those are the ones that have got the potential to do the most harm. Deal with your hazards then, which are most likely to cause harm, and then deal with hazards that could affect a lot of people. And also consider short-term and long-term solutions. And as always, the best solution is to eliminate the hazard if you can. What happens if you identify a hazard and assess a risk, but you realize it's far too expensive or impractical to deal with? Well, the law says you must properly look at the risk, but resolving a risk should be reasonably practicable. And that means that you've also taken into account the cost and looking at the likelihood of danger and the severity of the consequences. It's about balancing the risk against the cost of the measures required to control that risk in terms of money, time, and trouble, and then making a sensible decision. If the risk outweighs the cost, then you have to do it. However, if the cost outweighs the risk, then you don't have to take that path. You can't ignore it, but you may be able to follow a less expensive, less difficult route, or even consider putting off doing the event. Fireworks could be assessed but then the wind direction changes, and it then puts the public at risk from falling debris. So you go, okay, we're not going to do that risk now. Mukesh, would you like to take over now? Because I'm starting to lose my voice.
Not to worry, where are we now?
We are risk assessment practicalities.
Okay, so basically, thank you. Did a good job there. The law says that if your organization has more than 5 people or 5 employees, volunteers that is, and you have decided a risk assessment is necessary, then you're required by law to write it down, whatever you decide to do, even if you decide to do nothing. If you've got more than 5 volunteers, you've got to do a risk assessment. The risk assessment is a clear record of the fact that you considered the hazard and made some decisions. And if something happens, it's useful to have a written record of the hazards you identified and when you're doing and what you're doing about it. Volunteers must be told what the risks are. And I think so we are about recording any accidents perhaps has happened or any unusual risks for future. It's worth recording it down in your minute book or whatever. Oh, we came across such and such a thing, so we must look after that in the future. People need to know what you're doing about the hazards, and if there is anything that they need to do. Make sure that they know how to find out about this information. One way is to make your club risk assessment accessible. So publish it, so people are aware of what's happening. Try to keep your risk assessment as simple as possible. No flowery language. Keep it simple. It shouldn't be too long or complicated. The law says that they must be suitable and sufficient. That's a very important word there. And for this to be so, you should be able to show that a proper check was done. You ask who might be affected. Demonstrate that you dealt with all the significant hazards, taking into account the number of people who might be affected. Your precautions and reasonable, and any remaining risk is acceptable. You involve your volunteers in the process, and you sought help if it's needed. Very important. Keep everybody involved. Your risk assessment should include your club name, your name, the person who carried it out, the date it was carried out, and the date of the next review. Reviews are very important. As I say to you, that I tend to do 3 reviews initially before the event, a few days before the event, and while the event is taking place, and perhaps you do a post-mortem saying, did everything go well? You should be clearly show the hazards you identify as being significant, the people who may be harmed, how they may be harmed, and what you're already doing about it, and if further action or control measures are required, what they are, who needs to carry them out, and when. So next slide, please. So here is what we have. How do we measure risk? So what we got is a 5x5 matrix. It basically gives you what the risks are. I don't particularly want to go through in detail. It's fairly straightforward. So we've discussed the hazards, looked at the consequences of the hazards and the likelihood of this consequence actually occurring. The level of the risk is a product of the likelihood of the hazard occurring and the consequences. Is basically this matrix. You judge yourself and say that, how likely is that going to be happening, and what are the hazards, and that way you can focus and say that this needs urgent action or stop. It's a quite nice little matrix. It's a 5x5 table in the industry, is well used as well. I think we'll go to the next slide, please.
So I'll just say here that the way you use this matrix is you take the consequence, so be it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you multiply it by the likelihood of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then that then gives you whether you're going to do no action, monitor it if it falls into those numbers, or take an action. You need to do something right now, or you need to stop the activity.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. So how we want your risk assesses? As Craig mentioned that, but what does this all mean in practice? And here we can see what needs to be done for each of the risk levels. A trivial risk of 1 to 2, you don't need to do any action. A tolerable risk of 3 to 6, you just need to keep an eye on it, perhaps long term, to see if it's possible to reduce the risk. A moderate risk of 8 to 12, basically improve within the specified time scale. You could still continue with the event. A substantial risk of 15 to 16, you need to do something about it now to reduce the risk before you attempt the event. It could be catastrophic. You might need to just stop. This level of risk is unacceptable, so you might need to stop it. Let's go on the next slide. So we just basically recapping on the hazard, the type of harm they can use, then use the hierarchy of hazard control to reduce the likelihood of harm. So basically we had on the left hand, we had all the possible risks, the physical, mechanical, chemical, psychological, ergonomics, biological, what harm each particular risk could have. So slips and trips and falls, illness caused by infectious diseases. Well, we've been through COVID, caused by physical injury. So we talked about manual handling, claims against lions, very prevalent. I'm not talking about lions, I'm talking about the industry. Legal action could result of our inaction, or we haven't done something properly. So be aware of that. Then we look at the control, the risk. Can you eliminate the hazard, reduce the impact, prevent contact, implement safe systems of work, permits, procedures, instructions? I think it's a little bit permits. We don't need permits, but in other industries, you need permits for hot work or working at heights and things like that. PPE is important. Hard hats. I don't think we work at height that much, but high-vis jackets, we use them for car park controls, etc. But I think the important thing is delivering your message, telling people, your team, where the hazards are and what implementation, what you implemented. Next slide, please. So this is a standard template, which is on our website, and which basically says what is the hazard, who might be harmed, how might people be harmed, existing risk controls. Then you have the risk rating, which is the 5 by 5. Additional controls, what you're going to do. So we talked about trailing cables and either we're going to tape it down, etc. Etc. So who is it monitored by? Action monitored by when? So basically you have name of the assessor, the date when it was done, the time when it was done, your venue or whatever, and task been assessed is your function. So you're doing a senior citizens party or a children's party or whatever. Next slide, please. Right. So I think we've been through the appendix 1 on a previous one, and I think we also been through the likelihood, the highly unlikely, etc. We went through the scoring system as well. So I don't think you want to go into that. You want to add anything, Craig?
This is just the guidance sheet that's on the back of your risk assessment template. That's all this is really. Just to give you sort of like aid memoir when you're doing your risk assessment, really.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So here is a sample one done. It's about lions using a gazebo. So one may think it's a simple task, but when we talked about it, where is it going to be put up? Have you looked at the weather conditions? How are you going to anchor it? Are you going to have issues about manual handling because they can be quite heavy, etc. So it's a good one for you to just look at it and see how it's one typical one is produced. I don't particularly want to go through in detail. Do you, Craig? Do you want to highlight anything?
All I want to highlight is the ratings and the residual risk. So
yeah.
So when you first do your risk assessment, you then score it, which gives you your current rating. Then once you've worked out what your control measures are going to be, you then re-rate it, and that then gives you your residual rating. So how you've reduced the risk. So it's showing you that's what the risk was at the start. This is what it is now. Put my controls in, and obviously noting who's going to be doing it, which helps reduce the control. So it's all about your paper trail again.
Yeah, so basically by putting in controls and looking at the matrix, you reduce risks in certain areas. And as Craig said, that who's going to monitor it? So once again, you got a dynamic risk assessment going in there. And at what point you're going to monitor it as well. Remember, you have to date and time it as well every time you do that risk assessment, so you're aware of what's happening. I think that's basically the end, but I want to cover a few points. The district secretary wrote to all the clubs asking for you to complete a form. It basically said who your health and safety officer appointed in the club is. I've had limited response. I probably had about 15 clubs responding. Very important. It was sent to you for a particular reason, that you need to have a responsible person on your committee. Somebody who has some knowledge will be beneficial, but as also Craig mentioned, there's a huge amount of information available. The HSC website is particularly good. There's some free information. I'll give you an example of manual handling. It's got some diagrams. It tells you what you can lift, how you can lift. It's quite interesting if you are doing heavy lifting. Remember, each and every one of us has a duty of care. And I also mentioned before that if you fall foul, it's a criminal offense. Our insurance company will ask for a risk assessment. If you haven't done one, then they will probably refuse cover. So please do one. Well, another important matter, which is not within our province, but if you're dealing with young people or aged, disabled or aged, then it'd be beneficial to have a TPS done and recorded and minute in your book. So if you're dealing with people like that, it is due to reputation of Lions. We talked about that it's worth recording accidents. If you got a minor accident, just put it in your minute book saying, there was such and such, and so you prevent that in future occasions. I don't want to talk about COSH assessments because the COSH assessments are more specialist things, and hopefully you won't come across that at all. Right, and just finally, just to say what are the benefits of managing safely? What are the benefits? So we get improved health and safety performance. We reduce accidents and injuries, better complying with legal and regulatory requirements. Increase productivity, because if you deal with steps, you sort of say, oh, we could do that better, or we could do it safer. Improved and retained reputation for Lions, very, very important. We don't want to fall foul and in the press that such and such thing happened to the Lions as well. I think that concludes us. We are into a little bit over about 50 minutes.
That's all right. That's fine, no problem.
So on your screen at the moment,
Oh, sorry,
you'll see that you've got Mukesh's contact info and mine if anyone wants to take a note of that. So if you want to refer back to us for anything in the future, if you've got any queries about events and you need some advice and guidance, here's our contact information.
Yeah.
And in a second, I will flip slides and
just one thing, Craig.
Yep.
Yes, that's an important point. This when you scan this, the
QR codes.
Yeah, you will also see the websites as well. This will take you straight to our district website, straight away, and all the insurance details, the insurance schedule, what is covered, typical risk assessment of a template for risk assessment, allergy form, how to organize an event. It's all there. And if you just click it, you can see everything there. Failing that, you can contact me or my colleague Craig. We can help you. Email is the best way to contact us. One final thing, we can't do a risk assessment for you because we don't know your I get phone calls 3 days before the event saying, can you please do a risk assessment? And I said, no, I'll look at it, make comment on it, one or two, but I can't give you any further comment because I haven't been to the venue. I don't know what the details are. Thank you, Lion Viresh. Craig, you want to say something about useful links?
Yep. So here are the links for the for the MD Health and Safety website. To get in there, you do have to register. It's free to register, but that then gives you access to the bookcase with all of the health and safety and insurance documentation that you might need. And underneath is the link, which is the same as our QR codes, that takes you to the district website.
Yes, and we too also have a bookcase as well with all the relevant documentations on the bookcase.
That's right. Thank you, Mukesh and Craig, for that excellent presentation. A lot of information taken, but I hope this answers some of the questions you might have had. Now, I'm happy to take questions. If you have a question, use put your digital hand up. In the meanwhile, I can see in the chat, Jan Constable has put up a question, and her question is, where does the 5x5 matrix come from? Is this from the new legislation? Can we have a source reference to look at?
The 5x5 isn't in the legislation. It's something that we that's used a lot in construction, and you can use a 3x3 matrix. We find a 5x5 matrix gives you a little bit more granular detail, but you can expand that out and go by a 10x10 or by a 20x20. There are examples of this on the health and safety website.
Yes, there is on the HSC as well. But the 5x5 gives you a bit more precise risk rating as well.
Yes.
It's just one way, it just keeps the judgmental matter out. You know, it basically just does it for you, as Craig explained to you.
Excellent. Yeah, so that answered Kadu's question. It's the information is there and will be, these slides will also be made available on the district website, so you can have a look at it there. John Taylor, you have two questions.
Good morning, fellow Lions. Yes, I may have missed it. Forgive me if the question has, or the questions have been answered. Risk assessments with regards to events that we attend that are pre-arranged but by somebody else. For example, our club has a boat trip arranged, a canal boat trip arranged, and all we've done is we've contacted the owner of the boat. They have a restaurant, they have everything that they need in place. Do we have to do a risk assessment for that event, or do we rely on theirs? That's my first question. And if we hold an event in, say, a back garden of somebody's house, like a barbecue or something like that for our club, do we have to have a risk assessment for that if it's semi-informal, for example?
Two very good questions. Let's take the first one first. So
yeah, sorry. The first one, this is my opinion. I don't rely on anybody. I would the least I would do is I would look at it and say that is it sufficient for our needs? It may be, because some of these organizations have a risk assessment and they're very well done, but for my own sake, I just want to glance at it, just make sure that it complies with what our Lionistic requirements are. I'll give you an example. I think the ambulance, they demand a risk assessment from us, and I ask for a risk assessment from them as well when we do the senior citizens party. So, you know, I would look at it. I think it's good practice. I wouldn't rely on somebody else's, blindly.
It's best to ask for a copy of theirs, just to see if we can
exactly.
adapt it.
I think if you ask them for a copy of their risk assessment and you have reviewed it and you find that's not unreasonable, I think you could rely on that. Also,
public liability insurance, I would get a copy of it as well. There's been instances on a canal boat, on the Thames, etc. The second one, can you remind me what it was? Oh yeah, the garden party. Be careful, because we've had instances. There was once many years ago, somebody was doing a barbecue. An Indian lady was wearing a sari, and she probably got too close to the barbecue, and there was a minor mishap. It wasn't officially recorded, but I had a phone call. So I think, once again, I would say do a risk assessment. do proper control measures, and file it. It depends on number of people and who's coming, obviously. I would do it and just file it for your records.
And that would
Right?
be the officer in the club that would do
Yes,
that,
yeah.
the club
Yeah,
officer.
so
Okay.
I think you need to be reasonable. You know, if you do your barbecue at home, you just want to make sure that people stand clear. So how do you do that when you got a lot of guests? You have cordoned it off with a tape or something like that, so people don't get too close to it. Craig, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, my only opinion is if you're the organizing club, then my opinion is you should be doing the risk assessment. If you're attending someone else's, if you're helping out at someone else's event that's been organized, then it will be on their onus to have the risk assessment, but you should check that they have one.
Cool, thanks. I shall speak to our club officer on that then.
I think it's a very straightforward thing to deal with. I mean, okay, barbecue in the garden, back garden of somebody's house. You know, what are the hazards? Mukesh just mentioned one of them. Going too close to the barbecue. I mean, any sensible person will be aware there's a hazard there. But if you're wearing a sari or a document like that, they should be aware of it themselves anyway. But yeah, maybe your Lions should be there to sort of stand around it and make sure nobody comes too close to it. That's how you're taking care of the risk. Am I right?
Yes, I think that's reasonable. Depends how many people are attending. Is there a Lions event? I would just fill up that risk assessment form and say,
That's
look,
it.
yeah, and just file it. So
Yeah.
if there is an issue, if the lady comes back, in fact, the lady rang me. Lady comes back and say, look, this is what has happened. So if you have taken proper precautions and she has circumvented and come very close to the barbecue, then there's contributory negligence as well. So look, it's better to do it than not do it. If you have a barbecue for yourself and your family, obviously, I'm not suggesting you do a risk assessment. But
for club-based work,
yeah, I would do it.
Yeah,
I would do it, and I would file it. At least it
thank you.
focuses your mind on the risks which could be identified.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank
So
you very kindly.
there's two interesting points made in the chat, but before that, Alf had his hand up, but he's disappeared. Alf, are you still there?
I've come back. I had to go and answer the door.
All right. So what's your question, Alf?
First of all, it's congratulations on the presentation.
Good.
Thank you.
Yes, well, it's actually it verifies a lot of things that I've always keep trying to tell people, and I must admit I'm guilty of not carrying a lot of them out. I tend to forget while I'm working. I have been doing this or doing sort of risk assessments for over 55 years. That was even before I became a Lion. In those days, you didn't have to do any forms. You just had to tell the police what you'd done. I find the problem is the newer members don't take much notice of instructions when you're telling them what hazards could take place at an event, if you understand what I mean. And I admit, I am a hazard now to be around an event. In fact, most of the time, my members make me sit down because a few of you know my health problems. The other thing is, are these screens, or whatever you call it, the lists available in PDF form folder or booklet?
They will be available as PDFs on the district website. Okay.
Yeah, because a lot of the new Lions need to get this in their hands and read it. And I mean, read it.
Sure.
I can come up with, the 25 years I used to run the swimming galas.
Sure.
The newer Lions in our zone, we'll start a gala. oh, we got plenty of time, 5 weeks. They don't understand all the health and safety regulations required. Eric Amara knows all the rules and regulations. You know, that they are there, not in paperwork as such, but it's things you have to do. And it's very, very hard to get the newer Lions, because all they turn around and say, oh, we're volunteers. And that's their answer for not taking any notice. So it's
Thanks.
very hard for the 2 insurance people of our district to keep an eye on them. That's all I'm saying. But otherwise, I've really enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you, Al. That's
It's
very kind.
reminded me, well, Mukesh knows me from old.
Yeah.
I pick a lot of people up at events when I'm there, what they're doing and not shouldn't be doing. But basically, that's not my job. But I've been involved such a long time. It's natural for me, getting up people's noses.
Okay, very quickly, can I just deal with these 3 questions on the chat? Bal, these forms will be available. They are on the district website. Jen Constable, do you have a look at that, Craig? The question there. Updating of the training available?
Can I just quickly come to that?
Yeah.
Yes, there is IOSH training, managing safely available. Obviously, the Lions don't provide that. You have to pay for it yourself. But there's a lot of stuff on the website. If you go on the YouTube channels, if you put it in, you will get a lot of information, possibly the full presentation as well. So it's worth venturing onto YouTube, and you'll get that. In terms of the 5x5 matrix, that is what the current, you know, I wouldn't say required.
I was thinking more of the availability of the lists you produce, because I find that's more effective if someone's got it in front of them. You understand what I mean? To be able to read in their own time.
Yes.
Yeah, the lists will be available on the district website. Going back to the 5x5 matrix, that is, I think it's an IOSH sort of standard. Perhaps you are used to another one, but this is the most recent one. The industry more or less uses that as well. Craig, do you agree with me?
Yeah. And I'll just note for Jan there that yes, we've been on the IOS training, and this presentation today isn't going to cover all the gaps from where you've done it 20 years ago, because the IOS training is over 3 days, and we've just had to pick points and do a streamlined presentation in an hour.
I'm not complaining about your presentation at all. I'm just sharing my concerns because I did a 2-week IOS training via my employer years ago, 20 years ago. And so I'm used to, because I was responsible for a lot of buildings and people in local government, I'm used to doing that kind of risk assessment. But having seen your presentation today, I'm completely out of date in terms of the changes over the time. And I'm also aware that all the cost stuff, which isn't included, again, I'm out of date on. So for me, actually attending this has made me realise I shouldn't be doing risk assessments anymore. And that's why I was asking the question is there an update I can do? Because, you know, I'm not going to be paying to go on a course if I'm, you know, and I'm not the only one. All of the Lions who are being responsible for health and safety need to be doing it properly. Otherwise, we shouldn't be doing it. And I feel personally, having had this, you know, good opportunity to look at stuff and see that things have changed beyond my current knowledge, that I'm no longer safe to be doing them based on the presentation today.
Jen, sorry to jump in. first of all, please don't even think of that. What I hope this has not put you off doing health and safety.
I'm being very clear. No, it has, because
No.
I if I don't do things properly, then I'm not prepared to do them. So I can't continue if I can't get the appropriate training for doing it.
We need to take a common sense approach to all these things. Yes.
But that's what you've said, but actually the presentation and what we're being expected to do, this five matrix and all the rest, is far more than I currently do. I do simple assessments, which I'm accustomed to, using 20-year-old material, and I do the reviews and all the rest of it. And I think that my club take it very seriously, and new members take it seriously.
I would say that's fine, because you're doing for your club, you're doing what within your experience, you're doing what's reasonably practical.
Yes, but the stuff that you're putting onto the website is dictating, is saying we should be doing it this way, and I am not currently doing that way, and I don't consider that I could without the additional training.
Let me come in. You've got tremendous, you said 20 years experience.
No. I said 20 years ago I did the training.
Yes, but I think there's enough information available. If you go on the HSE website, it'll tell you about cost statements. It'll tell you about matrix. In fact, the HSE, they have a very simple risk assessment template. There is a lot of information.
Yes, but you're not saying my current risk assessment template is adequate. This training is saying what I have been doing is no longer suitable, and you've now got new formats, and I've read it it went through very quickly, so I did my best to make notes and read it, but I cannot currently adapt that practice to what I've already been doing, because it's completely different and it's far more complicated.
What we'll do is we'll feed this back to the rest of the health and safety team, and maybe we may need to look at doing some further modular training for different areas, perhaps.
That's a very good point. I think, Craig, that's the way to approach this.
What club are you? Sorry, what club are you?
Northwood Lions. And as I say, I've got no complaints with my club. They're very supportive. They take health and safety very,
What you could do is you could send us an example of your risk assessment, and we can certainly have a look and say, yes, that's acceptable, because we're not saying you have to use these forms. These are a guide. As long as your risk assessment's got that sort of information in it, then that's
I've every confidence and faith in my risk assessments, but what I'm saying to you is they're nothing like what you're saying we now should be doing, and I don't personally feel that I can adapt from doing a system that is tried and tested, which I and my club have confidence in, and we've never had any complaints and we've never had any incidents. We learn by experience, we review all the time, and every person takes individual responsibility.
And to be fair, until I did the IOS training, I hadn't seen the 5x matrix, and I was NEBOSH trained. And we did it a slightly different way, and we didn't use a 5x5 matrix. But the 5x5 matrix does take some of the guesswork out and does help.
I'm not arguing against it. I'm just simply saying I don't feel that I have the capacity all the time to do what you're asking us now to do.
Yeah, so we'll feed that back to the health and safety team at our next meeting, and we'll think about some additional modular training.
Thanks for your contribution, Jan. That's very helpful.
And I'd like to say, I'm not complaining. And if it sounds like I've been very happy with this training today. I wasn't sure what we were going to get, but it was very helpful.
No, thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Anyway, we take the point on board, and there probably is nothing between your assessments and the one we talked about, they're probably similar in all respects, to be honest. So don't even worry about it. Maybe you can have another offline chat with Mukesh and Craig at some stage and take it from there. But just to wind up, there is a question there, more of a general one, and that's something which I think is the back of everybody's mind. Most of the events which we do carry out, most clubs carry out, are of a generic nature, recurring nature. So the risk assessments are basically quite generic in nature, which are reviewed annually. Is this approach acceptable?
Let me come in. There are 2 points. One is complacency.
Yeah.
We get complacent and we sort of say, well, I've got the generic one, that'll do. And the other one, the point is having a dynamic risk assessment. So it's worth looking at your generic assessment, possibly a day before, on the day, and say, is it still sufficient for my needs? I think that you just can't sort of say it works on every occasion. So it's worth looking at these 2 points. Don't be compliant or complacent, and look at the dynamic. Look at it, review it on the day or day before. That's what my comment is. It could be acceptable, but it's worth looking at it as well.
So just to remind ourselves, risk assessment is obviously important to make sure we don't have any accidents, we don't expose ourselves to claims from the general public, our members and people like that, and also to basically have some defense, if you like, when it comes to making a claim for insurance purposes, and the insurance companies start coming up with all sorts of excuses for not paying us or on the claims. So it's not really, we're not really running a commercial building company or a business. We're looking after Lions and carrying out Lions service activities. But let's always be conscious of the fact that there are risks and health and safety concerns which we need to address. And it's really a responsibility not just of a health and safety officer in a club. I think it applies to all of us, which is why my email went to all the Lions in the district, suggesting that it is something which we all need to be aware of and we all need to think about. So I hope today's session focused our minds on the need, and the contributions from fellow Lions have been very useful, which it will take forward and move things forward. And hopefully, if nothing else, those of you who are here will go back to your clubs and remind them or tell them that we need to start thinking seriously about general health and safety issues whenever we organize events, including simple things like setting up a stall somewhere, or running a barbecue in the back garden, or going on a boat trip, which has been organized by somebody else. So Mukesh and Craig, on behalf of everyone, can I thank you very much for your presentation. And as I said, it will be available. The recording of it will be also online. So if you want to review this all at a slow pace, do so, please, whenever you have the opportunity. And there's a library of information on our website, which is always being supplemented and added to. Look it up, you make use of it. The forms are there, examples are there, everything is there. Thank you very much for attending. We look forward to seeing you once again in a month's time. Unless there's a change in last minute plans, which because of Christmas might happen, but we'll let you know through emails. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a nice weekend and see you again sometime soon. I'm going to stop the recording now. If you want to